If you look at the global map of natural resources, Brazil has, well, it's always been this historic, undisputed heavyweight in iron ore.
Right, that's the baseline everyone knows.
Exactly. But if you look closer at the data from just the past 24 months, you see this staggering pivot. Like almost overnight, the country has positioned itself to control the critical minerals of the future.
Yeah, jumping from an absolute zero footprint to being the world's fifth largest lithium exporter in under 2 years. It's a whiplash-inducing structural shift.
It really is. But it brings us to a pretty severe macroeconomic tension. I mean, the global green revolution requires aggressive extraction, right?
Yes, and Brazil is attempting to manage this massive new boom while still carrying the scars of catastrophic dam failures. Not to mention a highly mobile shadow economy of, illegal gold rushes.
Which makes it such a fascinating topic. Welcome, everyone, to a brand new deep dive. We're your guides to unpacking the most complex macroeconomic sources and data sets out there.
Cutting through the noise to find the actual mechanisms driving global markets.
For the record, today is Thursday, April 23, 2026, and the extensive data collection and research for today's analysis were finalized based on the 2024-2025 Advanced Economic Analysis Edition. So welcome formally to Macroeconomy AI, and to today's deep dive, titled Prospecting Mining in Brazil.
We want to express our genuine gratitude to you for tuning in today. Whether you are analyzing supply chains for your firm or just keeping ahead of global commodity trends, well, we appreciate your time.
We absolutely do. And before we dive into the heavy lifting, please engage, like, and share this broadcast, bringing a compilation of analyses and news on macroeconomics, technology, and artificial intelligence. That is our mission here at Channel, Macroeconomy AI.
We also want to thank today's sponsor, Global Market Insights Suite. If you are tracking volatile commodity shifts and need real-time, actionable macroeconomic data straight to your dashboard, it's an indispensable tool.
You can find the link in our description for a free trial. The platform's predictive modeling is actually perfect for visualizing the exact kind of structural market concentration we're about to break down. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
To understand where Brazil's mining sector is heading with green energy, we really have to isolate the sheer, well, the gravitational pull of its current architecture.
Because mining accounts for roughly 4% of Brazil's entire GDP.
Right. And the top-line number for 2024 that just jumped out of the research is a sector revenue of 270.8 billion reais. That is a 9.1% increase from 2023.
Which is wild because looking at the broader commodity charts, international iron prices actually dropped by 9% during that exact same window.
Yeah, it looked like a total contradiction on paper. How do you have a primary export losing nearly a tenth of its value, but the sector's revenue expands by the same margin?
Well, it comes down to the currency data. The international price of iron ore is quoted in US dollars, but the operational reality of these mining companies, their payroll, logistics, municipal taxes, it's entirely denominated in Brazilian reais.
Oh, right, because throughout 2024, there was a sharp devaluation of the real against the dollar.
Exactly. So the currency exchange rate acted as this massive shock absorber. By the time those lower dollar-denominated sales were converted back into local currency, the absolute volume of reais was actually higher.
Wow. But the currency buffer only tells half the story, right?
Yeah, the other lever they pulled was sheer physical scale. To offset the cooling price environment, the sector simply increased the volume of extraction. They just pushed millions of additional tons of raw material through the export infrastructure.
And that physical volume really reveals an extreme market concentration, because iron ore alone makes up 59.3% of the total mineral production value in Brazil.
And an astonishing 68.7% of all mineral exports. It's massive.
That concentration is exactly what makes the sector so precarious, though. I mean, when I look at those percentages, I don't see a diversified, resilient market.
What do you see?
I see a high-speed, multi-lane freight corridor that, well, it only carries one product and terminates at a single set of factory gates, like a massive cargo ship with just one engine and one destination. In the first quarter of 2025, 65% of all Brazilian iron ore exports went directly to China.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that specific trade corridor represents the definition of structural macroeconomic risk.
How so?
Because Brazil's mining sector isn't just selling to China, it is intimately tethered to Chinese domestic industrial policy. If Beijing decides to cool down its infrastructure spending, or if the Chinese real estate sector enters a prolonged contraction, those shockwaves don't just hit corporate balance sheets.
They hit local governments instantly, right?
Yes. The CHEM, which is the financial compensation or royalty paid to the state for extraction, hit 7.44 billion reais in 2024.
And municipalities in states like Pará, specifically towns like Parauapebas and Cana dos Carajás, are entirely reliant on those disbursements. Their local budgets are essentially derived from Chinese steel demand.
That dependency really cannot be overstated. A dip in Asian industrial output directly threatens the paving of roads and the funding of public services in the Amazon. But before we transition into the operational risks, I need to clearly state a crucial reminder for you listening.
Go ahead.
Whenever we discuss the market share or operations of industry giants like Vale, ticker VLLE3, or CSN Mineração, ticker CMIM3, this is strictly for structural and macroeconomic analysis. It is emphatically not investment advice. We are mapping the architecture of the economy, not guiding portfolio allocations.
An essential distinction. Now let's look at the physical reality of extracting that sheer volume of iron ore. Pushing that much rock out of the earth creates an equivalent, staggering volume of waste.
And managing that waste has forced a total regulatory overhaul in Brazil following unimaginable tragedies. The systemic failures of the tailings dams.
Right. In November 2015, the Fundão Dam in Mariana collapsed, releasing a torrent of toxic sludge that killed 19 people and devastated the Rio Doce Basin.
Just horrific.
And then, in January 2019, the dam at the Corrego do Feijão mine in Brumadinho failed. 272 people were killed. It stands as the deadliest work accident in the country's history.
And the engineering flaw common to both disasters was the a montante, or upstream, dam design. It is a design inherently vulnerable to seismic or hydrological shifts.
Yeah, from looking at the engineering schematics and the sources, the upstream method is essentially building a retaining wall out of the very waste you are trying to contain.
That's right. They build a starter dike, pump in the wet, muddy tailings, and wait for the surface crust to dry.
Then they build the next tier of the dam directly on top of that compacted waste, stepping inward and upward.
The appeal is purely economic. It is by far the cheapest containment method. But the physics of it are a precarious balancing act. The structural integrity relies entirely on the underlying tailings remaining solid.
And the fatal flaw is a phenomenon called static liquefaction, right?
Exactly. If that compacted sludge becomes saturated from heavy rainfall or gets disturbed by a minor seismic tremor, the solid waste suddenly behaves exactly like a liquid. It loses all shear strength, and the foundation of the entire structure just dissolves in seconds.
Wow. In 2020, the Brazilian legislature responded with Law 14.066. It was a sweeping mandate that explicitly banned the upstream construction method moving forward.
It also required all existing upstream dams to be decommissioned, mandated emergency action plans, the PAE, and increased maximum regulatory fines to 1 billion reais.
We also saw the socio-environmental settlement from the Brumadinho disaster reach 37 billion reais.
The financial penalties are historic, but the legislative action introduces a really complex logistical reality.
Well, I'd argue the legislation, while necessary, doesn't actually immediately neutralize the physical threat. I mean, does passing a law actually diffuse these ticking time bombs?
It's a fair question.
Look at the data provided by Greenpeace from January 2024. In the state of Minas Gerais alone, there are still 344 registered mining dams. And more concerning, 49 of those are still officially classified as medium or high risk.
Right, because passing a law in Brasilia doesn't instantly dismantle a 50-meter-high wall of compacted sludge in the mountains.
Exactly.
Which is why the industry refers to these structures as passivos ambientes, or environmental liabilities. Decommissioning an upstream dam safely is an incredibly delicate, multi-year engineering process.
You're essentially trying to diffuse a kinetic energy bomb without triggering that static liquefaction we just discussed.
Spot on. The National Mining Agency instituted a strict monitoring system, the SIGBM, to oversee this. But the foundational problem is that internal corporate auditing has historically failed.
Yeah, the sources noted that just before the Brumadinho collapse, the dam was paradoxically classified by the operating company as having a low risk of failure,
even though it acknowledged a high potential for damage if a breach occurred.
That paradox is exactly why independent third-party oversight is non-negotiable. You can't allow self-assessment when the potential energy of millions of cubic meters of tailings is suspended above populated valleys.
And managing and dismantling these legacy liabilities will tie up billions in corporate capital over the next 2 decades.
So the regulatory net is tightening around corporate mining with these billion real fines and strict decommissioning mandates. But that intense regulatory pressure brings us to a fascinating, entirely parallel dynamic in the Brazilian economy.
The shadow economy.
Yes, there is a sprawling, highly lucrative extraction sector that operates completely outside of this new regulatory framework. The illegal garimpos in the Amazon.
The illicit gold supply chains present a fundamentally different set of macroeconomic challenges.
And the constitutional boundary is crystal clear. The Brazilian constitution strictly forbids any mining activity within indigenous territories, the TIs, unless there is explicit authorization from the National Congress.
An authorization that has never been granted under the current democratic constitution. Yet, the satellite data shows industrial-scale incursions.
Looking impartially at the federal enforcement data from IBAMA between 2021 and 2024, the government launched an aggressive, militarized crackdown in the Yanomami territory.
And the result was an 85% to 92% reduction of new illegal mining areas within that specific zone.
Which is impressive. If you stop reading there, it looks like a definitive victory for federal enforcement. But the broader data set reveals a pretty frustrating behavioral shift.
The displacement effect.
Exactly. The illegal operations didn't pack up and liquidate their assets. As federal helicopters secured the borders in Roraima, the data shows illegal mining expanding by 93% in the Sorari indigenous territory down in Mato Grosso.
Classic.
It really is a massive, tragic game of whack-a-mole. You secure one border, and the problem simply tunnels to another state.
How does a country manage a sector that is completely off the books? Well, first we need to look at the terminology. The term illicit capital is the accurate framing here. We need to dispel the myth of the solitary prospector panning in a river.
Right.
The scale of modern illegal garimpos requires a sophisticated, highly capitalized logistical network. We are talking about the deployment of heavy excavators deep in the jungle, clearing illicit airstrips, and complex supply chains for diesel fuel, food, and internet communications.
And the footprint is devastating. The sources indicate over 13,000 hectares of forest were destroyed by this activity in 2023 alone.
The deforestation is highly visible, but the most severe long-term impact is chemical. These operations rely on elemental mercury to amalgamate and separate fine gold dust from the river sediment.
And that mercury is then burned off, contaminating both the atmosphere and the aquatic ecosystems.
Exactly. It bioaccumulates in the fish, poisoning the indigenous populations that rely on the river systems. But beyond the profound human cost, there is a severe macroeconomic penalty for the entire country.
I was wondering about that. How does illegal gold panning in remote regions impact the broader national economy?
Through the systemic risk premium, global capital markets are increasingly beholden to stringent supply chain auditing. When international investors look at a country struggling to police its own territory, unable to prevent the laundering of conflict minerals or massive mercury contamination, it severely degrades the nation's overall ESG profile.
Environmental, social, and governance.
Right. It creates a reputational headwind. A foreign sovereign wealth fund might hesitate to invest in a completely legal, highly regulated Brazilian wind farm simply because the overarching country risk profile has been compromised by the shadow economy.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
The reputational damage bleeds across sectors. But despite the heavy anchor of that iron ore dependency, the billion-dollar legacy of dam liabilities, and the shadow garimpo economy, well, Brazil possesses an undeniable geological lottery ticket.
The energy transition supercycle.
Yes. We are seeing the very beginning of it. The world desperately needs critical minerals. Listen to the concentration of these reserves detailed in the sources.
It's quite staggering.
Brazil holds 94% of the world's known niobium reserves. They possess the second largest reserves of rare earth elements globally, sitting at 23%. They hold 26% of the world's graphite and 12% of the global nickel supply.
And then there is the explosive growth of lithium. The rapid development of the lithium valley in the Jequitinhonha region of Minas Gerais has elevated Brazil to the fifth largest exporter of lithium almost overnight.
Which is an incredibly strategic inventory.
Absolutely. Niobium is critical for the high-strength, lightweight steel alloys required in wind turbine pylons and aerospace engineering. Rare earths are the non-negotiable raw material for the permanent magnets spinning inside electric vehicle motors.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Having the minerals in the ground is just a geological accident. The strategic insight from the analysis highlights a severe value-add gap.
Right, the difference between raw export and processed goods.
Exactly. Right now, the bulk of what Brazil exports from the Lithium Valley is a raw mineral concentrate called spodumene. Exporting 1 ton of that raw spodumene brings in roughly $800 US. But if that same ton of raw material were processed domestically into battery-grade lithium hydroxide, it could fetch over 8,000 US dollars on the international market.
You are looking at a 1,000% premium captured entirely by the processor, not the miner.
I see that dynamic, and it reminds me of the old colonial trade models. It's like selling raw wheat for pennies while buying back the artisanal bread for $20.
That's a great analogy.
The numbers demand domestic refining.
Yeah.
So looking at the macroeconomic landscape, why is Brazil stuck selling the raw ingredients?
Well, moving from extraction to advanced industrial chemistry is arguably the most difficult leap for an emerging economy. Converting spodumene into lithium hydroxide isn't a simple mechanical process.
It takes more than just a big factory.
Much more. It requires roasting the raw ore at over 1,000 degrees Celsius, followed by highly complex, volatile chemical leaching. To do that at an industrial scale, a country needs absolute grid stability, cheap, uninterrupted baseload power.
Which isn't always a given.
Right. It also requires a highly specialized metallurgical labor force and a regulatory environment that gives foreign chemical companies the certainty to sink billions of dollars in capital expenditure into a plant that won't see a return for a decade.
So the ultimate challenge isn't just extracting these critical minerals. It's proving you have the resilient infrastructure and the tax simplicity to sustain advanced chemical engineering.
Precisely. The macro prize here is transformational. If Brazil can overcome those infrastructural bottlenecks, if they can establish domestic refining for lithium and rare earths, they rewrite their position in the global supply chain.
They evolve from a simple commodity supplier tethered to foreign industrial cycles into an indispensable high-margin hub for electric vehicles and clean energy tech.
It's a completely different economic reality.
So what does this all mean for you synthesizing this data today? It leaves us with a profound structural paradox to mull over. The global markets desperately need Brazil's critical minerals to build the clean infrastructure of the future. The smart grids, the EV fleets, they rely entirely on the niobium and lithium buried in Brazilian soil. But when clean energy requires hyper-aggressive extraction in a country still actively trying to heal from massive dam disasters and struggling to police its own frontiers, can the green revolution truly be green?
That tension will undoubtedly shape commodity markets and environmental policies for the next generation.
Definitely.
And before we conclude our analysis today, we must clearly present the mandatory disclaimer. This deep dive into the source material is a compilation of open, third-party projections intended purely for informational and educational purposes.
Important to note.
It carries no ideological bias. It is absolutely not investment or financial advice of any kind. Projections frequently change based on new information and external facts, and past performance is never a guarantee of future results.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration of the Brazilian mining sector gave you a sharper, more nuanced lens on the logistical realities behind the data. We warmly invite you to join us for future episodes as we continue to map the complexities of the global economy.
It has been a privilege to share these insights with you. Stay analytically sharp and keep questioning the data.
That was today's Macroeconomy AI. We'll leave it here. You all stay well and keep an eye out for our new broadcasts. Subscribe to our channel, access the links, and follow Macroeconomy AI on social media.